particularly with Twaweza, where one of my colleagues, Banawani, is going to be speaking later. For today, I've been asked particularly to talk through kind of two areas around Tanzania's constitution. One is to give a potted history of Tanzania's constitution. Where have we been to get to the point that we're at now? And secondly, to give a snapshot of public opinion on constitutional matters. Given my role with Twaweza, I have kind of privileged access to public opinion data because Twaweza has done a lot of public opinion surveys in Tanzania in the last 10 years or so. And we have some good and interesting data on the constitution that I can share with you today. It's all published data, but I can share some highlights of that today. But I'll start with the timeline, the history. I'm going to zip through this. I'm not going to go through every word of the slides because there's quite a lot there. Essentially, the timeline of Tanzania's constitution starts in 1964 with the union of Tanganyika and newly independent Zanzibar. There was no formal constitution, but there was an agreement known as the Articles of Union, which had kind of two key features. Firstly, it created what's known as imperial presidency, with the executive being more powerful than the legislature. That was actually taken from the constitution of Tanganyika as was at that point. And secondly, it included the dual government structure that we are familiar with in Tanzania as the structure of government as it is at the moment, with a semi-autonomous Zanzibar government having its own executive, legislature and judiciary, with the union government in charge of the mainland and 11 specified union matters. That was 11 at the time. That number has grown considerably since then, but at the time in 1964, it was 11 specified matters. The Articles of Union also required the president to initiate a constitutional review within 1 year, though that deadline was extended pretty soon after by Parliament. Around the same time, an interim constitution formalized the arrangements as had been laid out anyway in the Articles of Union. Then into the 1970s, we see that various constitutional amendments were enacted, including some that made Parliament subordinate to TANU and the Afro-Shiraz Party, the two main political parties, in fact, the two only political parties in Tanzania on the mainland and Zanzibar. Those two parties merged shortly after to form CCM. It's a very unusual constitutional arrangement whereby Parliament is actually subordinate to political parties, but that reflects the political arrangements in Tanzania at the time. 1977, a new constitution was drafted by a CCM committee and endorsed by Parliament, acting technically as a constituent assembly in that process. It didn't change a great deal beyond what had already been included in the constitution, at least as far as the kind of the major points go. It retained the imperial presidency, retained the dual government structure, the semi-autonomous status of Zanzibar, and it enshrined the single party system in law a little better than had been the case previously. And that 1977 constitution, though albeit with very significant amendments, remains the constitution that's in place to this day in Tanzania. Through to the 1990s, President Mwinyi established the Nyalali Commission to establish how Tanzania might implement multi-party democracy. This was prompted by former President Nyerere, but endorsed by President Mwinyi, who established the commission. It called for a new constitution, repealed for various laws, but this was largely ignored by the executive. Parliament had no debate, and effectively CCM selected which parts of the commission's recommendations were to be accepted, and constitutional amendments were enacted accordingly. And this did establish a form of multi-party democracy based on an amended version of the 1977 constitution. 1998, then President Mkapa established a constitutional reform committee under Justice Robert Kisanga, which sought views from a large number of citizens. It proposed a three-government structure: Union, Mainland, and Isles. You could call it federalist, if you like, with the mainland and the islands being equal partners with a single overarching union government above them. Didn't happen. Only minor amendments of the 1977 Constitution were enacted as a result of that committee. Moving things 20 years on to 2011 to 2015, President Kikwete initiated a new constitutional review under former Prime Minister Joseph Warioba. Again, it heard the views of a huge number of citizens. According to the commission itself, they heard views from 1.4 million citizens, and there's good evidence to verify that. It presented its findings to a 640-member Constituent Assembly, which comprised all members of Parliament, and members of the House of Representatives of Zanzibar, and around 200 representatives of civil society. Now, the Commission proposed significant changes to the Constitution, including an independent electoral commission, independent candidates for President and for Parliament, term limits, reduced presidential powers, and importantly, a three-government structure. Much had been proposed before but rejected. A three-government structure comprising a union government, a mainland government, and a government of Zanzibar. Before this was due to be taken to a referendum, CCM pushed through some pretty significant changes to the draft through the Constituent Assembly, including rejecting the three-government structure. And as a result of how CCM were... Sorry?
Go ahead.
So there was I'm going to continue. I'm not sure what that was. The opposition parties that were part of the Constituent Assembly grouped themselves in a coalition that they called Ukawa, which was effectively a campaign against the constitutional process as was being pushed by CCM at that point. The proposed constitution, the one that was amended heavily by CCM, was set to be taken to a national referendum in April 2015. That never happened for logistical or perhaps political reasons. In particular, it needed a 50% popular endorsement on mainland and on Zanzibar. Whether it would have got that on Zanzibar is highly questionable. And it also needed a 2/3 majority in the Bunge and in the Zanzibar House of Representatives. And again, whether it would have got that in Zanzibar is highly questionable. In any case, that proposed constitution was never taken to a referendum. We then had, in 2015, we had the election of President Magufuli. And President Magufuli, in his time in office, he showed very little interest in reviving the process of the constitutional review, either the proposed constitution as it had been prepared by the Constituent Assembly or the Warioba draft. Neither was brought forward by President Magufuli, nor did he form any new commissions or task force or similar to restart the process. However, though nothing happened on the constitution itself, a lot happened on constitutional matters under President Magufuli, on democratic rights, on electoral processes, etc., which many have characterized as backsliding on democracy and on democratic principles, which led some to see even more urgency in constitutional reform. That opportunity wasn't there under President Magufuli, but the calls that started at that time to reignite the process have continued since moving on to President Samia Suluhu Hassan. Now, she, on coming to office, very quickly established better relations with opposition parties. She formed a task force on political reform under Professor Mukandala, which proposed various measures to improve the practice of democracy and political activity in Tanzania. And perhaps as a consequence of that, I'm not sure if it was a direct consequence, I think it probably was, a series of new laws and amendments were brought before Parliament late last year that included a very slightly more independent electoral commission. It's questionable how much more independent the commission would be under these new laws, but it had proposed that the electoral commission should be made more independent. No changes in other significant areas, though. So no changes on allowing independent candidates, no changes on who would be returning officers or the transparency of the count or on various other matters. And at the same time, the president has introduced no formal process to review the constitution, no new committee, commission, task force, or any other body formed by President Samia to review the constitution or to restart national dialogue on that. So these two cartoons here, if you can see them, they kind of represent between them the situation that Tanzania is in under President Samia on the constitution. On the left, you see her looking at the idea of a new constitution and thinking it looks like a decent idea, perhaps, but still continuing on with the current constitution. The cartoon on the right is very much suggesting that all that's needed, in her view at least, is to patch up the current constitution, that no major change is really needed. We can just tweak the constitution that Tanzania has rather than anything more substantial as regards changes. I'm going to move swiftly on to the second part, which is on public opinion. Again, I'm going to skip through these fairly quickly. This is a slide showing from the perspective of citizens how many reported themselves that they participated in the Warioba Commission's consultations. And we can see very large numbers. 29% of the population self-report that they attended a CRC, Constitutional Review Commission, community meeting, and 10 to 12% submitted opinions in various different ways. Those are huge numbers. It probably includes some over-reporting, but for a public participatory process, the amount of consultation that took place as part of that process should not be underestimated. It was huge. It would be very hard in practical terms to do more than was done in that process. So this was public opinion support for measures in the Warioba Commission's draft constitution. Here we can see the figures in blue show the measures that the public generally supported. Those in brown where citizens generally were in disagreement. So you can see a majority were in agreement across all these 5 measures. Recall for MPs that were underperforming, appointment of ministers from outside Parliament, MPs term limited to 15 years, 3 terms, independent candidates for election, and an independent electoral commission. All those ideas had broad public support as they were included in the Warioba draft constitution. Then this is a series of questions on changes that were made by the Constituent Assembly. So these are the changes that were essentially pushed through by CCM during that process. And in this case, there was less support for the changes made than there was support for the initial ideas proposed by Warioba. So low levels of support relatively for removing the recall function on MPs, removing transparency and accountability from the list of national values. All these things had low public support. To remove the term limits for MPs had low public support. It was 50-50 roughly on whether ministers must be MPs or should be appointed from outside Parliament. That seems there's less support on that. Moving swiftly forwards, if a referendum for the new constitution was held today, would you vote for or against the final draft that was presented to the president? So this is essentially, would people vote for or against the proposed constitution that came out of the Constituent Assembly in 2013. And we see there's more support for the Constitution than there were votes against it, or voting intention. I should say clearly that this is on the mainland only. So this particular set of data does not include people on Zanzibar, which is where perhaps the question is most contentious. But across 2013, 2014, and 2015, there were more people saying they would vote for the proposed constitution than would vote against it. Though in all cases, there were significant numbers who either did not know or who said they would not vote. Getting into a little bit more detail on that, though, this is not looking specifically at any of the various drafts or proposed constitutions, but just on the single question on the structure of government for the United Republic of Tanzania. And in this case, we do have data from Zanzibar. And what I think is particularly interesting, when you ask in Zanzibar what people's preference is for the structure of government for Tanzania, two ideas stand out, and they're pretty even. So you have the idea of the three government structure, where essentially it's a federal system with one union government and then separate governments for mainland and for Zanzibar, has just under half supporting it. Two governments, much as the current system, but with more autonomy for Zanzibar, also has just under half. The no change option has very little support in Zanzibar, just 5%. So in essence, on Zanzibar, everybody, or almost everybody, wants some change. The degree of that change in the structure of government that they want varies. Some want to go all the way to three governments. Some just want the current system, but with more protected autonomy for Zanzibar within that system. On the mainland, the figures are very different. If we look particularly at the 2017 figures, the largest group is the one that supports essentially no change. So the current system, two governments, no change, though there are significant numbers who either want a move to the three government system or more autonomy for Zanzibar, or indeed who want less autonomy, if you like, so a more unified system under a single government. There's quite substantial support for that as well on the mainland. Choosing between the two most recent draft constitutions, the proposed draft, that's the draft that came out of the Constituent Assembly, has support of 39% of mainlanders. The CRC draft, that's the Warioba draft, has the support of 41% of mainlanders. That's a tie. The one being 2% ahead of the other means nothing statistically. So essentially, people are very evenly divided on the mainland between those two versions of the constitution that they prefer. If we start again, where should we start from? Again, this is mainland only. Start from scratch or a blank page is the idea with most support. Start with the Warioba draft. Comes second. The existing constitution from 1977, that's a distant third. And the proposed constitution from 2014, the Chenge draft, as is sometimes known, is the least supported option in terms of a starting point for a new constitution review process. So essentially, this is where we're at. We have lots of people talking about a new constitution, but pushing in different directions, wanting different things from the idea. And yes, I think I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ben, for that detailed dive into the reviews undertaken so far on the state of public opinion, and including public opinion on drafts. Just in the interest of time, I think I'm going to go through each of the speakers, and then we'll get to Michaela as the discussant thereafter. So I'm now going to, hopefully, Alexander is there. I'm going to invite Dr. Alexander Makulilo to come to your turn to speak, please. Are you present, Alexander?
Yeah, thank you very much for being given this opportunity to participate in this forum and share my thoughts about this topic.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, first of all, before I proceed, I would like to inform this forum that I had the opportunity to participate in both processes, the Warioba process and the Mukandala Taskforce. So,
Dr. Alexander, do you have a camera on, or are you just off camera today?
I'm trying to connect it. It is not responding. I don't know why. It says you cannot start your video because the host has stopped it.
Okay, I'm not sure why that is. I don't believe we've.
Oh, could you see if you can make it not putting the video in the stuff? It'll make you co-host, that should work.
Yes, we have you. Thank you, Dr. Alexander.
Okay. Thank you very much.
That was us. That was our fault. Okay, please continue.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm saying I had the opportunity to participate in the two processes. In the Warioba process, I participated effectively as a consultant who advised on how to design the electoral system and how to manage elections. And this work, of course, I did it with my colleague, Professor Amos Muhina. But with the task force, I was a member of the task force. And so I had also the opportunity to work in that committee. And also I had the opportunity to talk to several many stakeholders about this topic. Now, I think much of the historical part of this process has been covered by Ben, and I'm not going to repeat about it, but I will just highlight some key issues and then proceed, in the current times where we are and in relation to the upcoming elections. We are expecting to have two elections. The first one in 2024, which is civic elections, and then the other one in 2025, which is the general elections. Now, let me begin by saying that writing a new constitution, especially in Africa's context, is a complex process. And of course, with the experience of other African countries, it has taken even sometimes more than 20 years. Part of the reason you could see there are competing interests. Groups are crashing from, to each other. But again, the specific context in that particular country matters a lot. This is actually what happened in Kenya, what happened in South Africa, and the like. Now, in the context of Tanzania, normally three issues come out to inform this process, whether to go forward or otherwise. The first one actually has been mentioned by Ben, is the union, the issue of the union between Tanganyika and Zanzibar. And this for Tanzania is very sensitive and very critical because it defines the unity of the country, the statehood of the country. And for that case, the question is how much autonomy Zanzibar should enjoy? What is the kind of structure which should be in place? And so many questions. Now, the most dangerous or critical issue when it comes to this, political parties have already defined their positions, whether I'm for two government structure, for three government kind of federal structure, and so forth. So this has been, a critical issue when it comes to drafting any constitution. The second one is the nature of the dominant party system. Now, I think it is also on a record that the ruling party has been in power, during the single party system, but also starting from 1992 when we entered into multi-party system, it has won many landslide victories. And of course, the latest development, I think it was in 2020, whereby the share of the presidential vote for President Magufuli went up to 84%. And it went also for the members of parliament, it went to 96%. So it was like almost coming to one party state. But that being said, I'm not trying to suggest that that is the situation throughout, because in 1995, the situation was different. The opposition had almost a 40% of share, of the presidential votes. And of course, they had some seats. And in 2015, you could see this number increased when the election was actually very, very competitive. So what I'm trying to suggest here is the ruling party is also very critical when it comes to determining when to write the constitution. And the third, which is also very important to me, I see, is also the political will of the president of the day, who is driving the state at that particular moment. You will see immediately after 1990s, the first recommendation to write a new constitution came from the Nyalali Commission, the Presidential Commission. And immediately after the 1995 elections and the elections thereafter, you could see that this agenda was picked by opposition political parties after being, after seeing that they are level to contest with the CCM was actually reduced. Then they were thinking that we needed to redefine the rules of the game so much so that it becomes fair to us to make sure that we also win some shares. So what I'm trying to suggest here, these three factors have been very, very critical. And the effect of this now is there is no way you can commence an abrupt process, constitutional process in Tanzania. You could see from 1992 up to 2010. You see, 2010, when the idea of writing the new constitution came in with the President Kikwete, and it was not even in their manifesto. And then you could see after this was an issue in the 2015-2020 CCM manifesto, this was an agenda to write it, to complete this process of writing a new constitution. But from 2020-2025, it was not an issue, and it is not even in the manifesto. But this does not mean that the demand for new constitution is not there. The opposition parties and the other groups, civil societies, some of the academia, and the the private sector and the like-minded, organizations have been pushing, for the new constitution. Now, the current status, as Ben put it very correctly, it was in December 2021 in Dodoma, sometimes around the 15th, 16th. They are convened a meeting of key stakeholders to discuss the state of democracy in the country. And out of that discussion, there came out, like, I think, more than 100 recommendations. And so the idea was to come up with a task force to study those recommendations, process them, and then write a comprehensive paper recommendations to the government for implementation. Now, from there, it's when the task force was formed. Now, I'm not going to what the task force, did, the processes and so forth, but I know it had its own terms of reference, and it completed the work with the report. Now, what I could say briefly is about the issues which were like recommendations from the task force. One, it was to open up the civic and the political space, particularly removal of the political ban to allow political parties to do rallies, but two, to do reforms of the electoral laws and the Political Parties Act, as well as the police ordinance, so as to make sure that the electoral field is fair for all political parties, but also to reform the electoral management body to make it more inclusive. But another, which was very critical, was to rework on the stalled constitutional making process so that the process could start again. And the other recommendations were to provide civic education, massive civic education, media freedom, and the inclusion of marginalized groups, including, the gender issues. Now, the effects of this, I can just mention quickly some.
Yes,
January.
just briefly, if you could, just maybe one more minute.
Okay, fine. So in January 2023, the political ban was removed, but there was increased space, for freedom to freedom of expression. But some laws have been reformed, although some political parties like Chadema are not happy so far, and they are still voicing for more reforms. And lastly, it was that the process to write the new constitution could commence after the 2025 elections, not before. But my last word is that we, in Tanzania, we have organized previous elections, 6 of them, using the same, the same constitution, and it gave different results. Mm-hmm. But what I wanted to suggest also, it depends on who is driving the state. According to, I think from Ben, President Samia, of course, she identifies herself with the 4 R's: the reconciliation, resilience, reforms, and rebuilding. And she seems to be more, receptive of these changes. Right now, as I'm talking, opposition political parties are allowed even to do demonstrations in the country. So I'm sure in the next coming elections, if the political space is going to open like this, I'm sure the opposition will likely gain its momentum and then go back to the house. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Dr. Alexander Makulilo, thank you for your time there. And thanks for really summarizing as a voice from the front line the issues you've seen arising, particularly around the union, the nature of the dominant party system, and ultimately, as you've just reiterated, political will. So I would like now to pass on to the next speaker, which is who is Mr. Barwani Mshale, Director of Learning and Strategy at Twaweza. Are you there, Barwani?
I am here. Good afternoon.
Good. Let me just give you access to the video. Hopefully that will work. Yes, yeah. It does. Fantastic. Thank you. Please proceed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Not to repeat what Ben and Professor Makulilo has said, I'll just pick on from where they left and I'll proceed from there. So in summary, it's clear that we are headed towards the upcoming elections, both the civic or local elections and the general elections this year and next year, without a new constitution or any anticipated major constitutional reforms. And I'm saying it, that without even constitutional reforms, given what happened or what transpired during the recent process to amend a number of laws that Ben Taylor mentioned. The bills were introduced in Parliament in November last year, and then public consultation was conducted early this year in January, and then the entire Parliament debated on them and made the decisions or their recommendations. And clearly, most of the amendments that they proposed did not really touch on the suggestions, the recommendations that were coming from the different corners, such as the Mukandala Taskforce, but also the Tanzania Center for Democracy's convenings that happened in 2022, 2023, that touched on the same laws as well, but also other processes, including the reconciliation talks between the CCM and Chadema, but also other reconciliations and the convenings organized through the Office of the Registrar of Political Parties, where they had agreed on some of these reforms to make the National Electoral Commission more independent and to create conditions that would enable holding free, fair, and credible elections. Most of those recommendations were not included in the bills that were tabled to the Parliament for the discussion. And some of those recommendations were not included because they said they would require some reforms or amendments to the Constitution. And therefore, any recommendation that required some constitutional reforms would not be included in amending those laws. And then what happened was that there was an active suppression of any discussion around the constitutional reforms, even in that parliamentary process. Before you would submit, the chair of the parliamentary committee would ask if you have any opinion on constitutional reforms or amendments. And if you would say that you had any, then you would be silenced. You'll be told, no, we are not here to discuss amendment to the Constitution. We are just going to be discussing these bills, and you have to refer to the specific sections of the bills that were proposed or tabled to the Parliament. So clearly, there was intentional desires to silence or to suppress any discussions on amending the Constitution or even some minor constitutional amendments. As a result, in my view, and it's not just my view, but I think a number of people share this view, is that while there are some commendable efforts that was there in submitting these bills to the Parliament, but there were great opportunities that were seriously missed given the substance of those bills that were tabled to the Parliament. If I can just quickly run through, for instance, the Political Parties Act, the main proposal there was mainly to amend the Political Parties Act to require political parties, for instance, to specify their policies, including their gender and social inclusion policies, but the proposed bill remained silent about all the very restrictive changes that were made in 2019 that criminalized otherwise normal political activities by opposition political parties in particular, but even CCM as well. But we know that there is a selective application of the law such that these restrictive laws would only limit or restrict the opposition political parties. So the amendments, the proposed amendments remained silent on those problematic clauses that were introduced in the 2019 amendments. When it came to the Electoral Financing Act, again, the main proposal there was with regard to reporting on electoral finances, the time in particular, how much time a political party is given to submit audited financial statements, who financed their campaigning and all the electoral processes. But there wasn't much that other stakeholders through the TCD process, the Mukandala Taskforce, and other convenings came up with that were included in the proposed amendments. Similarly, when it came to the National Electoral Commission Act, the bill ignored some of those that were not even controversial amendments that were proposed. Again, clearly one can see the intention is not really to make the election fully free, fair, and credible, but at least to signal that there are some amendments that are proposed and remaining silent on some other proposed amendments on the excuse that they would require some constitutional amendments and then rushing through this process the way it is being done. And it's not really going to make our elections free, fair, and credible. On the election of the president, the parliamentarians, and the ward councillors, again, there are some opportunities that are missed there in terms of including some of the recommendations that were tabled from the Mukandala Taskforce, the Registrar of Political Parties processes, and the TCD processes as well. So clearly one can see, yes, there are some changes that have been proposed, and it's commendable, and the process at least allowed for some time for the stakeholders to reflect on what has been, to analyze and reflect on what has been proposed. But again, when it came to the actual content of the bills and what is proposed in terms of the changes, a lot has been left out. And then when you look at the actions from these changes, it makes one wonder whether there is a very good alignment between what the president stands for, and that is the 4 R's, as Professor Makulilo has mentioned, vis-a-vis what some of the state agencies and the bureaucrats are doing. Because clearly, the president allowed for these commissions, for the task force to go on for the convenings, including the different political parties, to happen, and they come up with these different recommendations. But then what is included in these amendments falls short of the expectations. It makes one wonder whether these other actors within the state have actually understood this 4R philosophy, or maybe they haven't, or maybe they have, but they're intentionally ignoring making these amendments because it doesn't work for them. These, I would say, would be perhaps the legacies and the continuities from the previous regime. They are not so happy with some of these proposed changes. That is why they would come up with some tactics of making sure that the changes are not happening the way one would have hoped that they happen. And as in the description of this event and in your introduction, you mentioned that there are factions within CCM and even in the opposition political parties as well. Perhaps these factions have a very important role that they are playing, even in slowing down the aspirations and ambitions that President Samia has. So as we are headed towards the elections this year and the next year, I think it's really, really important in paying attention to the differences and the tensions that are happening within CCM, within Chadema, and in other political parties as well, in that they're going to have a crucial role to play in how the elections will happen. Thank you. Let me stop there.
Rouhani and Charlie, thank you so much for that candid overview and some of the challenges you see in terms of implementation and the disconnect perhaps between proposals and then the reality of realizing those through amendments and so on. So thank you for that. I would like to now pass over to our last but not least to our fourth speaker, Elsie Eyakuze, and before we then go to sort of discussion. So let me get Elsie, give you access to this. Let's see. Are you on video? Does it work? Yes, it does.
Hello. Hello. First, maybe a quick mic check. Can you hear me?
Perfectly.
Because I have a fan on, so I'm not sure of the quality. Yeah.
Perfectly, yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, hello. My elders on the panel as well. Good afternoon. I want my contribution to come from the perspective of a citizen on the ground, really. There are 5 points that I want to make based on my experience and observations. In 2011-2012, when President Kikwete put together the Warioba Commission, I was quite excited by the thought that a new constitution might happen within my lifetime, maybe within my youth, actually. So it was very informative to hear from Ben that this process more or less started in 1992 when I was still a child. And it looked for, at least I believed, that this process would actually come to fruition, not knowing that it has a 20-year span, as Professor Makulilo said. But I was intrigued, and I think a lot of us were, by the fact that this happened in 2011, 2012, when effectively Kikwete only had maybe a year or two of effective presidency left to him. So that made us question a little bit, at least me, I questioned the real will to see this through. It actually put me in mind of something that happened when the East African community was pushing for federation, and Tanzania was having a tough time explaining its position of no. So President Kikwete, I think actually, we had a poll or a referendum, I can't remember exactly, in which over 80% of Tanzanians quite predictably said no. So we used our power to vote, or maybe we were used to illustrate that we were not ready for this, in a very short period of time before that decision had to be made. And I felt that maybe he'd used a similar tactic with this introduction of the new constitution process, in that it looked like it was going to happen. It would have looked great for his legacy as the head of state of Tanzania. But in effect, it was done so late in the presidency that it did raise questions for me as to how serious either he as a president or the state or his party, in fact, was to see this through, to see it come to fruition. The other thing is that I feel that the quality of our citizenship itself is quite poor. By this, I mean that the relationship that we have with our government at the local and at the central level has a very tangible imbalance in the power dynamic. The state uses subtle and overt means of maintaining its power, including violence when it needs to. When I heard Professor Makulilo speaking about the numbers, the numbers with which we voted in people in local government, MPs, even the president in this last election, I might be excused for being a little bit, for questioning numbers that high. There's something rather unusual about 80% plus in any real democracy. I mean, can you really win in those numbers without an element of coercion existing? I think we have to state that out loud. It's no good being diplomatic about it. And I think that does reflect the quality of our citizenship, of our democracy. When we talk about these matters, we also have to keep that in mind, that power is used to create an environment that is not always necessarily conducive. And I think this has made us dangerously cynical as voters. During elections, I have a habit of trying to get everybody around me to actually go vote, no matter who they're voting for. And it's, I think I'd say about 90% of the people I'm trying to convince are like, what's the point of voting at all? I know we have we have high voter turnout, it's true. But there is some cynicism as to whether voting itself or even democracy is for Tanzania, whether it works. So that's something else that I think.
We lost Elsie. Elsie, you're on mute. Are you still with us? We lost you. Sorry, Elsie.
Yeah. Okay. So my third point that I was gonna make is in terms of how the state maintains power, I did also check how easy or hard it is for a regular citizen to actually get a copy of the Constitution, because we kept talking about this document, and I was curious as to how many of us even own a copy. I happen to have one. I just thought maybe if I could get my hands on a couple more and distribute them to friends. It was harder than I anticipated. And there's a young man who was very curious about these matters. He was coming into his political consciousness at the time. So I told him the Tanzanian Law Society has offices nearby, and I asked him to maybe go check with them. And he did. He came back and said that he couldn't find, they didn't have any. So I actually double checked. I went myself, and they said that during the process of consultation for the new constitution process, they had copies. They don't anymore. It hadn't occurred to them to actually stock any. And they advised that I go to the government printer if I wanted to get a copy, which, I'm not really sure that I could. I can't say that I tested that by going, but it did kind of show that for an average Tanzanian, getting a copy of the printed constitution might be a bit of a mission. So when we talk about constitutional change, like, what are we even talking about? The larger issues, or is this a document that a significant number of us have had the privilege of reading? And it's a privilege, which I think is a bit of a problem. And this is also made worse, I think, by the fact that we have a problem with functional literacy. In the first place, we have poor education outcomes that shows up in research all the time. So when we talk about being able to manage information, I feel sometimes that maybe it's being presented to us in incredibly oversimplified ways. And this has narrowed down our discussion of constitutional reform significantly, in my opinion. I feel like we're not really grappling with it. Really, what we're doing is kind of dealing with matters on a very surface level. Not surface by, I don't mean it's shallow, but it's very compressed into maybe like 5 or 6 issues, whereas I think there's a lot more under the hood that we don't get to discuss at all or even raise, because we then get channeled and forced into very particular dialogues. So for example, the focus on Zanzibar versus mainland and how we're going to, share power and renegotiate our union has completely covered other issues of inclusion, such as gender, disability, age, even sexuality, if I dare to raise that issue. So there's a lot of stuff that gets thrown by the wayside. And I guess the idea is that we'll deal with that at some later date. When does that come? So I felt that playing off of the fact that we don't have access to the Constitution, we have poor literacy, poor maybe grasp of our legal framework, of our rights as citizens. This all plays into oversimplifying a process that I feel shouldn't be quite this simple. I'm content for it to take a long time, as long as it's actually meaningful, meaty, like we're reforming a constitution here, not just sort of redrafting an essay. So I feel like we could do a bit more there. And my last point is that we have a real problem with freedom of information and speech. We really do. Any efforts to improve these areas are met with resistance by the state, either overt or even using legal means. We're constantly passing laws and regulations that restrict the space in the media and for the public, what we can say, where we can say it, how we can say it. And this has a direct impact on the so-called dialogue about the constitutional reform. Are we really having a dialogue if you're, restricted to a very narrow, to a very narrow set of issues and to, very narrow channels in which to talk about these matters? And the lack of information being given to us, it doesn't even have to be in written form. I heard mention of civic education. From what I've heard from some organizations that want to engage in this, you need to get permission, I think, from the government to engage in civic education, which doesn't necessarily mean this is nefarious. It's not a bad thing. You don't want people running around saying whatever they want. But whenever our government says they're going to regulate a process, I am always a little bit concerned that there's going to be control within that regulation. And I think that all of this is, to me at least, signs that we are laboring under a geriatric ruling party and state. There's just a lot of resistance, I feel, about these processes of change, of modernity, of inclusion, of getting a constitution that's really going to bring Tanzania into the 21st century. There's a lot of clinging to our glory days of the 1960s, 1970s, the drama of the 1980s and 90s, opening up the economy, liberalizing politically. I guess we're still settling into that, but I do feel like we're being held back. Barwani alluded to it, but I want to just state it out loud that I think this is a problem. It might be a generational problem. Tanzania is a young country, something like, I'm going to say over 50%, but it's more likely maybe 80% of us are aged 25 and younger. And these are the people who are going to be voting. these are the people who are not being given access. And we're facing a world in which so much has changed. I just feel like all of these dynamics, to me, do speak to a clash that goes beyond just, political parties, people in power, our civil service, the administration. It's deeper than that. We're looking at a societal change that some elements, the elements that are older and in power, are resisting through many means. So I wanted to put that out there. Yeah, thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, Elsie. Thanks for, again, very candid remarks and going through a range of issues around access and sort of citizen cynicism, as well as issues around simplification, overall engagement, access to information, freedom of information, and of course this really critical issue I think you just raised, this challenges of creating a modern Tanzania, and what does that mean in this context, and challenges of actually facing the future. Thank you to all the four speakers we've had. I want to now give Dr. Michaela Kolod an opportunity to come in and act as a discussant and reflect, if you don't mind, Michaela, on what you have heard, and perhaps we can also then hear, if we have some time, at least from this room here, from a few people we've about 20 minutes left.
Sure, sure. Thanks so much. It looks like to turn my video on, you'll have to enable that.
I think I've just done that. It should be all right now, Michaela.
Yeah.
There it is.
Great. Thank you so much for inviting me to join. It's been a real pleasure to listen to this wonderful panel. I don't want to take up loads of time because obviously we want space for questions. I had a couple points I might want to just pick up on, mainly to throw extra questions into the mix that maybe can be discussed by panelists later if there's time. One sort of set of questions has to do with the politics of reform, and a second has to do, I guess, with the substantive impact and where we see reform leading. So I think it was really helpful kicking off with that timeline from Ben, walking us through these successive reform efforts, including after the multi-party transition, and how, to also echo a point that a colleague, Nico Minde, raised in an article last year, we've had presidents, all except Magufuli, putting forward some kind of reform process, under Mwini, Kapa, Kikwete, and now Samia. So, what is going to change in the situation to then see those through, to see something more substantive? I thought it was really helpful. All of Professor Makulilo's points about some of the challenges to that, highlighting the role of the ruling party, the role of CCM in overseeing this process, and political challenges that may raise. And obviously, Barani walked us through what maybe some of the quite minimal changes and obstacles that have been placed in the way of reform ahead of 2025 with the recently passed legislative amendments. So I guess the question that leaves with is, what situational change will bring about a bigger shift? Is it that we wait for after 2025, as has been sort of hinted, and then maybe there'll be more time and space for reforms, or do we need something bigger? There is a lot of conversation about this. Obviously, we've heard reference to particularly Chadema leading as an opposition party pushing for a new constitution. And they, seem to have a theory of change which stresses the importance of them pushing on that issue party and also mobilizing protest around it. There has been sort of observer commentary that maybe this isn't such a successful issue for mobilizing people. Maybe it isn't resonating to the extent that it might. And Chadema has been also emphasizing a broader platform around what we might see as more kind of bread and butter welfare issues that are obviously key to a sense of people's everyday lives and socioeconomic rights. So, is it through mobilization in that channel that we mobilizing in that area? And I guess we've seen politicization also of the constitutional issue, we can say in Tanzania, and then also if we look elsewhere, there's been recent discussion of how this has played out through successive reform efforts in Kenya, and the kind of partisan nature of campaigning around the constitution. So kind of trying to unpick those campaigns, sort of what's the substantive content and what is the partisan dynamic. Responding to a point Elsie made at the end, which I thought was really important, around a certain a cynicism or frustration, and kind of what are citizens' views on the Constitution, and that's certainly not for me to say, as I mean, among other things, an outsider, but one thing that has been sort of part of the discussion recently, again, is this question of linking the constitutional debates to substantive developmental concerns. And I suppose one area that strikes me is, how could those developmental concerns be integrated into constitutional reform discussion themselves? So obviously we've had constitutions like the South African Constitution really leading the way in terms of introducing socioeconomic rights. And one reason I raise this also is, which more recently looks at informal labor and labor organizing in urban areas. And I've been struck by how people I meet with and discuss with talk about the Constitution. It's not that there's disinterest, but there is a big emphasis on uhuru wakazi, sort of freedom in work, freedom in everyday life, and how can that be realized? What constitutional reforms would affect everyday lives? And again, people have mooted ideas like, what if there were rights for street vendors in the Constitution? Or, then it goes off in many different directions, but conversations around that might be interesting. I've talked for quite a long time already. I did want to briefly comment on the impacts of constitutional changes. I think there's a lot to also learn from other countries and trends across the region. Obviously, we've seen successes of the constitutional provisions that allow for challenges to presidential election results, which is something that some stakeholders in Tanzania have called for, in 2019, that did result in a presidential election being annulled and reruns with the opposition winning. So we've seen cases like that. We've also seen cases where the direction of change seems to point in another direction, towards more democratic retrenchment. So hinging institution, we might also question. I was struck by a point from Professor Makulilo, where he commented that we've had 6 elections or a succession of elections, and under the same constitution with very different results. So we also have to look at that broader political context of what we expect from the Constitution and what we expect from other questions of power and organization in society and politics. That was longer than I intended. Thank you very much.
Thanks for those reflections on what you've heard from our speakers. We do have we've got about 10 minutes, 11 minutes left. So I want to just see, we did have some questions in the Q&A. Do you have?
So we encourage people to put questions in. I think people have used this because they can't.
Yeah, I know the chat is disabled.
So we could just scroll through and see if anyone has actually put in a question. But perhaps we can also remind people that they can use the Q&A function.
Yeah.
We can also take questions in the room. So they can't speak to us on the webinar, but they can put questions in the Q&A and we'll be able to read those out to the speakers. but perhaps we come to someone in the room
Yeah.
while people.
Yeah, I agree. I'll just reiterate that. I hope that you were heard on the Zoom, but
Yeah, just reiterate.
yeah, just to reiterate what has just been said by Nick is we've just got a few minutes of an opportunity for you to, if you're on the Zoom, to put any questions you have into the Q&A. We'll almost certainly won't get through all of them, but if you have a few minutes, you want to quickly put some questions or points in the Q&A, feel free to. In the meantime, I'm going to turn to within the room here in our hybrid context and allow as one of our speakers to speak. Do you want to? I don't know if you'd be heard. So maybe
can you all hear me? Is that okay to speak like this?
We can hear you. Yes, Andrew. Yes.
Okay, great.
Right.
So you can hear
I'll be
Andrew.
very
Go ahead.
quick. I just want to make 2 points. First thing is that President Magufuli was the first president to die in office in the history of Tanzania. And that meant the 1977 constitution said that the vice president would succeed and would see out the rest of the term, rather than have another election and elect somebody else to finish the term. Now, the big question now is whether CCM choose Mama Samia to be their candidate in 2025 or not. If they don't, as a secondary question is what Mama Samia does about it. But either way, it will be an important element in the whole thing. Now, the second point to make is if you look at the history of Zanzibar, there was a time when it was the headquarters of an Omani empire. So Zanzibar has always had very close links with the Gulf, with the Persian Gulf and the Gulf states, which of course are very rich and very aggressive in some ways at the moment. Now, what that means is that if they have lots and lots of money, and you can imagine a situation where they could be almost swamping Zanzibar with enormous amounts of investment. Even now, there's controversy about investment from Dubai in terms of partially running or running a fair whack of Dar es Salaam port, which is in the mainland, not in Zanzibar. But it's an important element already is the relationship of mainland politics to the Gulf states. I'll leave it there.
Yeah.
But those are very important.
Thanks for those provoking
issues in the whole of this discussion.
Thanks, Andrew, for raising those 2 issues. Do we have so just checking here. Yeah, Nick, go ahead.
Hi, Bill. Great talks. Quick question for me. Is there any sort of vision here or engagement with what's happening in the region? Do people look at Kenya and say, Kenya got a new constitution in 2010 and that's really helped? And look at other countries where perhaps not having constitutional has been a problem. Is there any engagement with constitutional models elsewhere in Eastern Africa in terms of what you might look for if you were going to imagine a slightly different Tanzanian constitution?
I think I'm going to put that question back to our speakers, Nick, because I think it's a yes. How do we can't get community allow for the
We have to do this. We've got a very leading politician who raised his hand.
If you click on attendees on
Yeah.
the right, I'm not sure if you can allow him to speak. You might be, oh, I think you can. You can click
Let
allow
me-
to talk.
yeah. Give me a second. I think we've got a speaker here, and I'm just trying to.
Keep going down. And we've got all sorts of other people here as well.
I think he's down. I think he is down now. So,
One moment. Oh, there we are.
fortunately, by audio,
Yeah. Tundulisu, please go ahead and speak. You're unmuted.
Hello.
Yes, we can hear
Hello, do
you.
you hear me?
Yeah, can hear you. Yes.
Hello.
Hello.
Please go ahead. Please proceed.
Ben, do you hear me?
We can hear you.
Yes, we hear you, Tundulisu.
Hello, Ben.
We can hear you.
Hello?
We can hear you, Tundu.
We could promote him to panelists, in which case we'd come forward. That might help.
Hello.
No, we just made you a panelist. If you speak, everyone will be able to hear you.
We just go. Hello, Tundu, do you hear?
He's
Yeah, I hear you. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
And you can put your camera on if you're, if you would like to.
Okay.
It'd be good to hear from you. Are there?
All right. You get me?
Yes, we can hear you and see you. Please make your contribution.
Okay. 2 points. Number one, with regard to the general elections 2020, and I want to put this question to Professor Makulilo. He says that Magufuli got more than 80% of the presidential vote. I would like him to tell us where are those results to be found, because my understanding is the presidential results, and specifically the presidential results, have never been published to this day. The law requires the presidential results to be published in the government gazette, constituency by constituency, and so far, 3-4 years into the election, these results have never been published. So we need to know where we can find these results. That's number one. Number two, with regard to his comment about the role of the ruling party and the presidency, my understanding is since 1962, when we adopted the Republican Constitution, and it is the Republican Constitution which institutionalized imperial presidency, not the 1965 interim constitution. Since 1962, the president has always been in total control, not only of the party, but also of the state. The ruling party has always fed on the president's hand. We have never had a situation where the president of Tanzania was not at the same time the chairperson of the ruling party. So the party has, in essence, provided an ideological fig leaf when real power has always been exercised by the presidency. It has the fact that the reform process has stalled is not because of the ruling party. It has everything to do with the fact that the president and the state and its structures have resisted changes. I would like him to address
Okay,
those 2 points.
we've just got a couple of minutes. Thank you, Tundulisu. I will now, if I can, if you're still available, Alexander, Professor Makulilo, if you could kindly respond, and then I will do. Then we'll have a few minutes to just close up. Thank you, Tundulisu.
Yeah, thank you very much. Let me put my, thank you very much for the contributors. I will respond to 2 questions, and maybe I can leave others to the rest. With regard to many Tundulisu's questions about the results, I got the results from the National Electoral Commission website. And I think there is this, I don't know, Gazette of January 5, 5th January of 2021. I think you can display, you can get it from the, the National Electoral website. It is here, and maybe I can share with you. I've just downloaded it from there. And I want to also to just add on, to what Tindoris is saying. I'm not trying to say that having the 84%, 96% was a free and a fair election. I'm not trying to suggest that. What I'm trying to suggest is what was announced finally by the mandated board, which is the National Electoral Commission. So the Gazette is there. It is within the National Electoral Commission. Management body. So you can download it there. The second item is about the constitutional making process. Mm-hmm. What I tried to summarize from the first presenter, Mr. Ben, I said there are three issues which determine the nature, the process, the willingness, and so forth of doing this, constitutional making process. The first one, I said, is the union question. Whenever this process is brought on of writing the new constitution, that has been an issue, and it has put together, at all the ruling party and the opposition. But the second part, which I think Tundulis was put it correctly and very well, I mentioned about the nature of the dominant party system, the willingness of the CCM. And I said, if you revisit the party manifestos from 1995 to 2010, for example, there is no mention of writing a new constitution in the manifestos. But it was in 2010 when you see after that election, and the demands which came from the opposition and other groups from 2011, then these demands came and the process started. But then the ruling party in its manifesto of 2015-2020, they brought in the constitution, the manifesto. And very funny enough, the 2020 manifesto, 2025 manifesto, this issue of writing a new constitution is not there. And this brought me to the third factor, which is the political will of the president, of the day. Because, as Ben put very well, is the president, President Magufuli, was outright, he didn't like to commence that process. And they said, I did not even campaign around that. Okay. And the last final point I can make, it's about the, sorry.
I think we're going. I think actually we'll have to stop there, Professor.
Okay, let me stop.
We've run out of time.
Okay, thank you.
We've got a couple of minutes over if you want to let some of the others come in.
Yeah.
1 minute each.
Yeah.
If I wants to give us a kind of final salvo.
There is a. Okay, I'm just going to. I am conscious of time, and I know there are people who need to leave if necessary, but I'm very much appreciating this engagement and so on. There is, I think, I'm going to allow for one last question, which is from Abdul Paliwala, and I'm going to see if we can also just bring him in. Okay, Abdul Paliwala, if you would like to speak, and then we'll that will be our last comment. Thank you. Please go ahead if you are able to.
Yeah, just 1 second. It says I'm unable to start the video.
Okay, go ahead. Try again. If you just keep it brief, that would be great. And
very briefly,
over to you.
I thought the Warioba draft proposals were in some ways a high point of democratic development in Tanzania. With the world going anti-democratic these days, have we seen are we seeing the end of democratic processes in the country?
Very interesting comment. Thank you very much. I'm going to leave it there. We've had a great discussion. I thank everyone for their contributions, the speakers, the discussants, and then those that have been able to join us as questions at the end, Tundulisu and Abdul Paliwala. Thank you, all of you, for your time today. And this is a wonderful debate, and I hope we can have another either in the run-up to the election or thereafter. And we look forward to continuing to this discussion. So thank you, everyone, for the lively conversations and a much deeper understanding of the constitutional issues. Thanks, everyone, and goodbye.